Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss an interesting article. It was written by the political editor of the far right Spectator, but for the Times on this occasion. It broaches the tricky situation that thinking Tory MPs might find themselves in, almost like the caught in a trap, whereby they could be better off losing the next election than winning it for multiple reasons. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So such is the mess that the Conservatives are making with Boris Johnson in charge. People regularly ask me if the Tories are trying to lose the next election. Now, there is strategic benefit in doing so for a certain section of the Conservative Party, certainly. I just don't get the impression that the majority of Tory MPs want this, apart from anything else. Losing an election, even if you sort of see strategic benefit to the party, losing an election means many of them losing their seats. And when the Conservative Party, as I always say, is the party of the self, you have a higher proportion of MPs than normal who will only be concerned about themselves. And there are plenty in other parties that do that as well. But there is a strategic benefit. I've said a few times, as things stand, one credible option for the next election is a minority Labour government. Now, under those circumstances, it'll be difficult for Labour to achieve very much, in all honesty. They will have to negotiate for every piece of legislation. The economy is completely knackered. You know, because a big part of that economic buggering is due to Brexit, it's not going to be easy to turn it around. You know, Labour are promising closer alignment, which will help a lot, but it won't get them the economic boost that the last Labour government saw in its first parliament that sort of set them fair for the next few years. Basically, there's every chance that Labour might improve things. In fact, you'd expect they would, but not enough to persuade people to stop listening to the Tory tabloids, who will, remember, print a litany of woe every single day. All of us, like right now, it's like every bad thing that's happening in this country is something else. It's not the government. It's the war in Ukraine, or it's the EU being awkward, or it's COVID, or it's the last Labour government 12 years ago. The day Labour win power again, all of a sudden, everything is them. Everything is them. Then they will aim for the Tories to get back in. The day the Tories get back in, everything is Labour. It's that last Labour government. They'll blame Labour for what was down to 40 years of Tory rule, and then when the Conservatives win the next general election, they'll go back to austerity, blame the necessity on Labour again. Labour will have another crisis of conscience, maybe pick a suitable leader, maybe an unsuitable leader to take over, and the whole hideous cycle begins again. But that's from my point of view. Like, being honest, I come across very few Conservatives these days. It's almost like they try and avoid me. So I don't really know what's going on in the party other than what I read from correspondents who are talking to them. So this one in the Times by James Forsyth was intriguing because it talked about this very consideration. The author claims that some Tories are beginning to consider that it might be better to lose the next election, and for much of the same reasons. In fact, I'm actually just going to throw in there before I go into another bit. You've got to bear in mind at the moment, there are some Conservatives who are saying that their party is no longer the Conservative Party. You know, we know former grandees like John Major are saying that. But there will be Tory MPs right now who can't publicly say it, but are thinking it. You know, they've already seen some of their moderate champions purged from the party. They don't like what the current Conservative government are doing. And they know that it's not going to change whilst in government, because the way they're doing things at the moment is seen as an electoral asset. If they win the next election, it'll double down. You know, so the only way to stop it is for the Conservatives to lose, for what they've become to be an electoral liability. But this author also talked about a fear if they lose, because the best outcome for the Conservatives is actually for Labour to win a strong majority. Sounds mad. Surely that'd be the opposite of what they want. It's not. And it's related to electoral reform. So let's go back just over 25 years ago. Now, people say Tony Blair made a manifesto promise in 1997 to introduce proportional representation. He actually didn't. It's one of those things that people misremember, like Bogart saying, "Play it again, Sam," or Holmes saying, "Elementary, my dear Watson." Never actually happened. Not that I'm excusing the situation, because there was a very heavy implication that Labour would introduce proportional representation, and they absolutely should have. But the manifesto, when you read it, only promised a review with a recommendation for a form of PR. And that happened. That all took place. But neither Blair nor the wider Labour movement really had much of an appetite for it. And I could spend a whole video going through all the finicky little reasons, but the main reason really is power. Put yourselves in the shoes of a Labour Prime Minister or a Labour Party activist. And you're in this strong position in government. You've just won a large majority. Now, in the long term, proportional representation means you will be in power for longer. But that power will be diluted in coalition. But you've just won power after 18 years of grinding Tory rule. Lots to be done. But if you have to share power, the other parties may not agree with you on what actually needs to be done. You're going to be fettered. So you don't introduce PR. You think to yourself, well, I can win a majority under first past the post now. I am now in the ascendancy, but I cannot win a majority under proportional representation. So you put it off. Maybe you tell yourself, when we've completed our great reforming work, then we'll do it. So we'll do this for the next 2 parliaments, then we'll introduce PR, maybe just as we're on the wane so that we keep the Tories from wrecking it all. But of course, it takes a long time to bring these reforms in. You leave it too late. You lose the election. The Tories are back in. Then what? Quelle surprise, they wreck all your work. Right now, I have never seen such support for proportional representation in the Labour Party as exists right now. Starmer's also in favour of it, but it's a political hot potato right now. So although he talks it up, even as leader, he's talked it up a little bit, he's not fully getting on board with it. But unlike with Blair, there's no ideological objection to it from him. It does have to be said, Starmer often seeks consensus for policies, though. Sometimes when Labour seems... Because I've thought to myself, Labour have announced a policy, and I've thought to myself, why wasn't this announced a few days ago? Should have been announced a few days ago. It's because he's getting people to agree with him. Whether that's right or wrong, I know people criticise Blair for being too presidential, some people described him as. Starmer's sort of the opposite way. He wants that consensus. For example, it turns out, I didn't know this at the time, it turns out that Keir Starmer wanted to offer his resignation if the police fined him over Durham right from the moment the reinvestigation was announced. At the time I was calling for him to do this, he was fully on board with it, it turns out. He was waiting several days because others around him in the leadership team thought it was the most insane thing he'd ever proposed. So it took a few days to get agreement. We may have a similar thing here. Starmer may or may not think it's strategically tricky to fully get behind PR now. Or it may be others in the strategy team. But according to this article in The Times, the great fear among some strategically thinking Tories, and we do not know how many this is, it might only be 2 or 3, is that Labour get behind it, then they're finished. Or some of them are finished. Because again, this is where the advantage is. But let's go through this first. It's quite simple. If Labour win a strong majority, they could easily change their mind on proportional representation and decide, actually, we're doing all right on the first past the post. Yeah, we'll keep it for a little bit more. Push ahead with a set of major reforms that other parties wouldn't otherwise go along with. Maybe we'll introduce it later. And then the whole hideous cycle begins. But if all Labour can do is win minority power, if Labour can't get a working majority, PR becomes a no-brainer for them because they're already having to share power. And if they keep first past the post, there is every chance that they will lose that power come the next election and the Tories will be back in. Change it to a more representative system and the Tories are shut out. The only way you'd ever see a Conservative Prime Minister in future is by moderating themselves, moving back towards the centre to the point where the Lib Dems at least are willing to work with them, maybe others. And that would take time. And that, I think, is also what is in the mind of some Conservative MPs. They don't like the lurch to the far right that their party has taken. And they'll be seeing this losing the next election as beneficial for a couple of reasons. First of all, if Labour don't introduce proportional representation, they're out for a term and then back in again potentially. Or if Labour do introduce proportional representation, there's plenty of Conservative MPs are already politically in the place that the Conservative Party would have to move to in order to win power under that system. So they will not see it as a disadvantage at all. And this is how mad politics can be sometimes. Like, if you consider the three, what I would consider credible outcomes for the next general election, because it doesn't seem credible to me that either Labour or the Conservatives will win a strong majority. So the realistic options, I think, are a weak Conservative majority, maybe 10 or 20. Conservative minority government, maybe they win 310 seats, say, so they're a bit short of a majority, but they're still significantly the biggest party in Parliament. Or a Labour minority government, let's say Labour win 290 to 300 seats, something like that. Now, the weak Conservative majority is no good. It's a majority government, but it's no good. As the article points out, Boris Johnson is already finding it difficult to get his MPs to behave. He's losing votes, and he has a massive majority. Now imagine with a much smaller majority, rebellions would be happening every week. A minority Conservative government is no good either. That puts them back to where Theresa May got them. In 2019, when her leadership was really failing, when Boris Johnson came in, they were winning hardly any votes because the opposition parties ganged up on them. The Tories would only have the support of the DUP, and the DUP would insist on utter insanity for their support. Right old mess. And then a minority Labour government will be trapped into working with other parties on all legislation, and so will be strongly motivated to make that the political model going forwards by pushing ahead with electoral reform of Westminster elections. Now, if that happens, the Tories as they are now are finished. They will have to evolve. They cannot be as they are now. The likes of Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Steve Baker, gone. What they want, those people, the likes of Boris Johnson and co, what they want is either a strong Conservative majority or a strong Labour majority. Because what they do not want is to get rid of first past the post. So either works for them. The ERG crew, the entryists, the far right of the Conservative Party, if they don't think they can get a strong majority themselves, they'll absolutely accept a strong Labour majority. Because either works. But neither seems credible. Even if the SNP lose seats in the next election, they'll still have Scotland sewn up. They're not going to lose a lot. And speaking of Scotland, major electoral reform is the only way to save the Union anyway, if it is at this point savable. Starmer's actually happy to talk about his commitment to more complete devolution. But as we've seen from the past few years, there is no power that can be redistributed around the UK under Labour that cannot be re-centralised under the Tories when they get back in. I've said it before. Never mind devolution. Never mind the NHS. Never mind the railways. Never mind energy or any number of areas where there is a huge disconnect between the Tories and other major parties. Forget about it all. Because unless you stop the Tories getting complete power, no work, no reforms, no progress in any of these areas will ever stick. And this is what actually gives me real hope, that out of this darkness that the country's in right now, we could actually be really quite close to a dawn. Or much worse darkness, because we're at a crossroads. But the one path that's definitely closed off to us is the one that goes back to where we were, what we would consider more normal political times. They're gone. The future is very different, but which one is it going to be? If Labour can have the confidence to get fully behind a cast iron promise to introduce PR in their manifesto, that would be huge, because it means there wouldn't need to be a referendum. It would be a manifesto promise. We're standing on this. And by definition, when you win power, you get to say that your manifesto was a mandate. Now, obviously, if you have to share power, you have to kick some things out. But anything that's of common interest, it'll be of common interest to the Lib Dems. It'll be of common interest to the SNP. It'll be common interest to the Greens, but they'll only have one MP. And I'll repeat what I've always said. I will support any Labour manifesto promise that works towards winning power. And I will support the absence of any if they're believed to be net vote losers. That includes PR. But if PR of some form can be on the manifesto, massive. Because then all they need to do is, with the SNP and the Lib Dems, win a majority, and there's nothing to stop them going ahead with it. And not a promise for a review and a recommendation. We've had that before. That didn't go too well. A commitment to introducing it in the next Parliament. The review will need to be there, but only for what sorts to go with. Single transferable vote has the support of the Lib Dems, of course, and some popular support. I don't like it. I prefer the model being developed in Wales, as I mentioned recently, but I will take it over what we have now. But if we can get that promise, imagine the impact. Lib Dem, Green and other actual non-partisan voters all over the country lending their votes one last time to Labour to get them over the line in order to not have their votes wasted in future elections. Kryptonite for the Tories. They could be gone forever. The Conservative Party will still remain, of course, like I've said, but they will have to adapt to the new system. And there are some Tory MPs right now who will be quite happy with that. And that because that new system will not allow for deranged far-right insanity. The swivel-eyed loons may split off into their own party and you just go over there, you sit with UKIP. They'll get a few seats. They'll get a few seats on the opposition benches and they can stay there. Labour will adapt too. I'm fully aware that the party will end up splitting and becoming a medium-sized party. The Lib Dems and Greens will grow to be equal in stature, but if we get this done, the party will have done its job, because it is better to share power for generations at a time than to spend most of it on the opposition benches watching an unfettered Conservative Party destroying the nation. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. Maybe even click on the join button if you'd be interested in memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.